Hey guys. Tonight, let's do something very ambitious and extremely low energy. Go ahead and dim the lights. Put the phone down somewhere safe. Get comfortable. And if you're already half asleep, perfect. You're exactly on schedule. Tonight, we're drifting back into the medieval world. Specifically, into a stone castle at night. No heating. No insulation. No electric blankets. Just vibes. Bad, damp, stone-cold vibes. Now, castles look very romantic in movies. Soft torchlight. Flowing banners. People dramatically staring out windows. But in real life, medieval castles were less cozy fortress and more glorified refrigerator with ambition. And at night, at night, castles became actively hostile to human comfort. Let's start there. Not with kings or queens just yet, but with the cold itself. Because medieval cold wasn't just cold. It was persistent. It was the kind of cold that didn't leave. It soaked into walls. Into clothing. Into bones. Into morale. Castles were made of stone. A lot of stone. Thick stone. Heavy stone. Stone that looks impressive in daylight and turns into a thermal nightmare after sunset. Stone absorbs cold slowly, but it also lets go of heat just as slowly. Which sounds helpful, until you realize there wasn't much heat to begin with. During the day, maybe the sun warmed the outer walls a little. Maybe a fireplace was lit for a few hours. But once night fell, the temperature dropped. And the stone held on to that chill like it was emotionally attached to it. If you touched a castle wall at midnight in January, it would feel exactly how regret feels. Solid. Unforgiving. And impossible to escape. Now imagine trying to sleep inside that. No central heating. No radiators. No, just turn it up a bit. Fireplaces existed, yes. But they were inefficient, smoky, and very localized. If you weren't sitting directly next to the fire, congratulations, you were cold. And most fires were allowed to burn low at night. Fuel was expensive. Wood had to be gathered. Charcoal took effort. No one was wasting resources just so people could feel slightly less miserable while unconscious. So as night crept in, the fire faded. The warmth retreated. And the castle reverted to its natural state. Which was damp. Castles were humid. Moisture seeped in from the ground. Rain soaked into walls. Snow melted and refroze. There was no waterproofing. No vapor barriers. No dehumidifiers humming quietly in the background. Just wet stone and cold air slowly shaking hands. And damp cold is the worst kind of cold. Dry cold is rude. Damp cold is personal. It clings. It creeps. It makes blankets feel useless. It turns clothes into chilled sponges. Now let's talk about windows. Or rather, the absence of windows as we understand them. Castle windows were small. Very small. Not for warmth, but for defense. Big windows meant arrows could get in. So instead, castles had narrow slits. Sometimes covered with wooden shutters. Sometimes covered with thin cloth. Occasionally with animal skin. Glass was rare and expensive. So cold air slipped in. Wind whispered through gaps. Snowflakes occasionally joined the party. And if you were lucky, your bed wasn't directly under one of these openings. If you weren't lucky, well, enjoy your personal blizzard. Now let's pause for a second and remember something important. The people sleeping in these castles were not peasants in huts. They were nobles, lords, ladies, kings, queens, the richest, most powerful people of their time. And even they were freezing. This is one of history's favorite jokes. All that power, all that land, all those titles, and still going to bed cold. Now, nighttime in a castle wasn't silent. It was quiet, yes, but not silent. Wind pressed against the walls. Wood beams creaked. Stone shifted as temperatures changed. Somewhere, a guard walked slowly along a corridor, boots echoing. Animals stirred. Dogs slept near doors. Maybe a horse stamped in a stable below. And in bed, under layers of fabric and fur, people tried to sleep. But sleep was different then. Medieval sleep was segmented. People didn't just sleep straight through the night. They had a first sleep and a second sleep. Between those sleeps, many people woke up. Not because of stress or screens, but because it was normal. You'd wake up. Maybe pray. Maybe talk quietly. Maybe just lie there and think about how cold everything still was. And during those waking moments, the cold was unavoidable. Your breath fogged the air. Your hands stayed tucked under covers. Moving even a little felt risky. Imagine shifting position and accidentally exposing one foot. Instant regret. A mistake you'd think about for minutes. And this wasn't a one-night thing. This was every winter. Every year. People planned their nights around the cold. They slept clothed. Fully clothed. Hats. Socks. Sometimes gloves. Nightcaps weren't fashion statements. They were survival gear. Heat escapes through the head. Medieval people didn't know the science. But they noticed the results. So they covered up. Layer on layer. Fabric. Wool. Fur. And even then, sleep wasn't guaranteed. Now, castles varied. Some were worse than others. Hilltop castles caught wind like a sail. River castles had damp rising from below. Northern castles faced harsher winters. Southern ones were slightly less miserable, slightly. But none were warm. And the higher your status, the bigger your room. Which sounds nice, until you realize larger rooms are harder to heat. A king's chamber might look impressive. High ceilings. Wide stone floors. Heavy wooden furniture. But warmth rises. And disappears. So kings slept in rooms where the heat never quite reached the bed. Which brings us to a quiet irony. The most powerful people in medieval Europe often slept worse than their servants. Servants slept closer together. In smaller rooms. Near kitchens. Near fires. Body heat mattered. Shared spaces stayed warmer. Royal privacy came at a cost. Cold. Lonely. Drafty. And somehow, still preferable to sharing a bed with courtiers. Now, as the night deepened, castles changed character. Daytime castles were busy. Footsteps. Voices. Activity. Nighttime castles were hushed. Most rooms dark. Only a few torches lit. Fireplaces glowing faintly, if at all. And the cold settled in fully. This is the moment we're lingering in. The deep night. Past midnight. Before dawn. When the stone has given up all pretense of warmth. When the air feels heavier. When sleep comes slowly. And this is where we'll stay for a while. Because before we talk about how people stayed warm, we need to fully appreciate just how cold it really was. So let's linger here a bit longer. In a medieval castle. At night. In winter. The wind pressing against stone. The fire reduced to embers. The bed layered but imperfect. A noble turning slightly under blankets. A guard shifting his weight in a corridor. A distant sound of wood settling. Cold. Quiet. Enduring. And in the next part, we'll finally begin to look at how people tried, sometimes desperately, to fight back against it. But for now, just rest here. In the dark. In the stone. In the cold. Alright. Welcome back. Or welcome again, if you drifted off somewhere between the stone walls and the dying fire. That's fine. That's kind of the point. We're still in the castle. It's still night. And yes, it's still very cold. But now, finally, we get to the part where medieval people actually did something about it. Not much. But something. Because despite appearances, medieval nobles were not just lying down and accepting hypothermia as a personality trait. They had strategies. They had systems. They had blankets. So many blankets. Let's start with the bed itself. A medieval bed was not a neat little mattress on a frame like today. It was a project. A layered construction. More like bedding architecture. First came the frame. Usually wood. Heavy. Solid. Sometimes raised off the ground. That height mattered. Cold air sinks. Floors were stone. Stone floors were brutally cold. So sleeping higher up was already a small victory. Then came the mattress. And no, it wasn't memory foam. It was usually stuffed with straw, or hay, or dried leaves. Sometimes feathers, if you were wealthy enough. Straw mattresses were lumpy, uneven, prone to shifting. But they did one thing very well. They trapped air. And trapped air means insulation. Now, over the mattress came layers. Sheets, maybe linen. Then blankets. And medieval blankets were not light throws. They were thick, dense, woolen. Wool was king. Wool stays warm even when damp. Which was important. Because everything was damp. Wool blankets were heavy. They pressed down on you. Which doesn't sound pleasant, but pressure traps heat. And then, furs. Animal skins were common among the elite. Sheep. Goat. Sometimes deer. Soft on one side. Warm on the other. Occasionally still faintly animal-scented. Nothing says luxury like sleeping wrapped in something that used to be alive. And yes, animals sometimes slept on the bed too. Small dogs were common. Not just for companionship. They were literal heating pads. A warm dog under the blankets was a medieval luxury item. Cats were less reliable. They came and went. Dogs stayed. Now, all of this sounds fairly reasonable. Until you remember the room itself was still freezing. So medieval people didn't stop at the bed. They built walls around it. Not stone walls. Fabric walls. Bed curtains. This is one of the most important details people forget. Medieval beds, especially noble beds, were enclosed. 4 posts. Curtains on all sides. Sometimes a canopy on top. These curtains were thick. Heavy fabric. Often wool or velvet. When drawn closed, they trapped heat around the sleeper. They blocked drafts. They created a tiny microclimate. Inside the bed curtain bubble, it might actually feel tolerable. Not warm, but survivable. Which, in medieval terms, counts as success. Curtains also blocked light, sound, and unwanted eyes. Privacy was a side benefit. Warmth was the main goal. Now, let's talk about clothing. People did not sleep naked. Ever. Sleeping naked in a medieval castle would be a bold and deeply regrettable choice. People slept in layers. Undergarments. Shirts. Trousers or gowns. Nightshirts were long. Loose. Made of linen or wool. And almost everyone wore a nightcap. This wasn't cute. This was practical. Your head loses heat fast. A wool cap could make a real difference. Some people even wrapped scarves around their necks. or slept with extra fabric tucked around shoulders. Hands and feet were the hardest to keep warm. Cold fingers woke people up. Cold toes were an ongoing nightmare. So socks stayed on. Sometimes doubled. And if you're imagining thick knitted socks, maybe. Or maybe rough wool tubes that did the job and asked for nothing in return. Now let's address something quietly uncomfortable. Sometimes, people slept together. Not romantically. Not scandalously. Just strategically. Shared beds were common. Even among adults. Body heat mattered. Two people under one pile of blankets stayed warmer than one. This was practical. Not emotional. Servants slept together. Children slept together. Travelers shared beds at inns. Even nobles sometimes shared sleeping spaces. Privacy was flexible. Warmth was not. Now, was this ideal? No. But medieval life was full of compromises. And warmth was a high priority. Now let's pause and imagine this scene. A noble bed. Curtains drawn. Wool blankets piled high. Furs layered on top. Two people lying stiffly. Not moving much. Because movement lets cold air in. Breathing slow. Trying not to wake fully. Outside the curtains, the room is cold enough to bite. Inside, it's slightly better. This is medieval comfort. Now, despite all this effort, people still got cold. There are accounts of frost forming inside rooms. Of water freezing overnight. Of breath frosting the air. So people adapted further. They used hot objects. Heated stones. Bricks warmed in the fire. Wrapped in cloth. Placed at the foot of the bed. Primitive hot water bottles. Except heavier. And riskier. Too hot, and you burned yourself. Too cold, and it did nothing. Some people used metal pans filled with coals. Placed nearby. Not too close. Fire was dangerous. Castles burned down. Often. So nighttime heating was cautious. Safety over comfort. Always. Now let's talk briefly about status again. Kings and queens had the best beds. The best blankets. The best furs. But they also had the biggest rooms. Which meant more cold. So royal beds were extremely enclosed. Tall posts. Thick curtains. Sometimes even wooden panels. A bed within a room within a castle. Layered defenses. Against both enemies and winter. And sometimes, it still wasn't enough. Royal letters complain about cold. Nobles mention sleepless nights. People talk about waking stiff and sore. Cold was accepted. Endured. You didn't expect comfort. You managed discomfort. And that mindset matters. People weren't constantly comparing their experience to modern warmth. They didn't know better. Cold was normal. Warmth was temporary. Sleep happened when it happened. And if you woke up cold, you adjusted. Pulled blankets tighter. Shifted closer. Waited for morning. Which brings us gently toward the next part. Because beds and blankets were only half the story. The other half lived in the walls themselves. Stone. Fire. And the strange way castles behaved when night fell. But we'll drift into that slowly. No rush. For now. Just imagine those heavy curtains drawn. The weight of wool pressing down. Breath slowing. The cold kept mostly at bay. Mostly. And we'll pick up from there, next time. Alright, if you're still with me, that's perfect. If you're drifting in and out, even better. Let's gently continue. So now that we've talked about the walls, the fires, and the general optimism required to survive a medieval winter night, let's slowly slide toward the actual bedroom itself. Because calling it a bedroom is already being generous. A medieval castle bedroom was less cozy retreat and more strategic survival zone. This was not a place designed for comfort. It was designed for endurance. And occasionally, status flexing. Beds, for example, were not just furniture. They were statements. Expensive ones. A proper medieval bed was massive. Not because people were tall. They were not. But because warmth loves company, and wood loves to be thick. The frame was heavy oak. The posts were thick enough to survive a minor siege. And the whole thing sat high off the floor, because cold air sinks, and medieval people absolutely noticed this. Being closer to the ceiling meant being closer to slightly warmer air. Not warm air. Just less cruel air. The mattress itself was not foam. Or springs. Or anything remotely forgiving. Most people slept on sacks stuffed with straw, hay, or dried leaves. The lucky ones got wool scraps. The extremely lucky got feathers. Feather beds were elite luxury. They were soft. They were warm. And they smelled questionable. Feathers absorb moisture. Bodies produce moisture. Castles did not believe in ventilation. So these beds slowly became warm, damp ecosystems. Which is not ideal, but again, not freezing felt like a win. Now let's talk about curtains. Because medieval beds often had curtains. And no, this was not about romance. This was about not dying quietly from hypothermia. These were bed hangings. Thick wool or heavy linen draped on all sides of the bed. Basically creating a tiny fabric room inside a stone room. Once the curtains were drawn, body heat stayed trapped. Breath warmed the space. Shared warmth multiplied. And yes, people absolutely slept together for warmth. Not romantically. Just logistically. Family members. Servants. Children. Sometimes guests. Privacy was optional. Survival was not. Let's gently float over to another detail most people don't think about. Clothing. Medieval people did not sleep naked. That would have been bold. They slept in layers. Thin linen shirts. Woolen garments. Sometimes hats. Yes. Hats. Nightcaps were common. Your head loses heat quickly, and medieval people noticed this long before science gave it a name. A sleeping noble might wear a linen chemise, wool stockings, and a soft cap. Basically dressed like someone expecting to wake up in frost. Because sometimes they did. Blankets were heavy. Often wool. Sometimes layered fur. Fur was excellent insulation. It was also itchy, heavy, and smelled like the animal it used to be. But again, warm. Now let's gently shift toward the people sleeping in these beds. Because warmth was not evenly distributed. Kings and queens slept better than almost everyone else. Not well. Just better. A royal bedchamber was usually placed away from outer walls when possible. Fewer drafts. More tapestries. More servants assigned to keep fires going longer into the night. Royal children often slept in shared chambers. Partly for supervision. Partly for warmth. Partly because medieval parenting had a very relaxed approach to personal space. Many royal children were described as sickly. Which makes sense. Cold, damp environments are not great for tiny immune systems. Now imagine being a medieval prince with a chronic cough, sleeping in a drafty castle, wrapped in wool, breathing smoke from the hearth. Not exactly a wellness retreat. And yet, this was normal. Let's slowly wander into one of the most underrated heating strategies. Animals. Yes. Animals. Dogs slept indoors. Cats too. Not for affection. For heat. A large dog at the foot of the bed was a furry space heater. Livestock sometimes stayed inside lower levels of buildings. Their body heat rose upward. Castles were layered ecosystems of shared warmth. Humans above. Animals below. Everyone breathing heavily. Charming, really. Now, let's drift towards something a little stranger. Hot stones. Stones were heated in the hearth, wrapped in cloth, and placed in beds before sleep. Like medieval hot water bottles, except less forgiving. If done correctly, they warmed the bed. If done incorrectly, they burned holes in sheets or caused injuries. Risk was part of the experience. Metal bed warmers also existed later on. Pans filled with embers slid between sheets. Effective. Also mildly terrifying. Now imagine this at night. Low light. Sleepy servants. Open embers near fabric. It's impressive more castles didn't burn down this way. Some did. But we're keeping things calm tonight. Now let's softly pivot to one of the most misunderstood parts of medieval sleep. They didn't sleep like us. They practiced something historians call segmented sleep. People went to bed early, woke up after a few hours, stayed awake quietly, then slept again. During that quiet middle time, people prayed, thought, talked softly, added logs to the fire if they could afford to. This wasn't insomnia. It was normal. Waking in the cold night was expected. You adjusted, pulled blankets tighter, shared warmth, and then drifted back into sleep. Silence was different then. No machines. No hum of electricity. Just wind. Fire popping. Occasional footsteps. And cold. Always cold. Let's gently bring in one more detail before we fade into the next section. Moisture. Cold alone is bad. Cold and damp is worse. Castles were damp. Stone absorbs moisture. Rain seeped in. Breath condensed. Sleeping in a damp bed meant chill set in deeper. That's why constant movement mattered. Fluffing straw. Replacing bedding. Drying furs when possible. Servants worked endlessly just to keep sleeping spaces tolerable. Which brings us to a quiet truth. Medieval sleep was work. Active. Managed. Never passive. You didn't just lie down and relax. You prepared. You layered. You planned. And if you were rich, you planned better. Now, as we slowly drift forward. In the next part, we'll gently explore how nobles, monks, and royals emotionally coped with these nights. The strange routines. The quiet fears. The oddly philosophical thoughts that come when you're lying awake. Listening to the wind push against stone. So take a slow breath. Adjust your imaginary wool blanket. And let's continue when you're ready. Alright, if you're still with me, or drifting somewhere between conscious thought and a soft nap, that's perfect. Because now, we're going to linger in the quiet, odd little ways medieval people coped with the cold at night. Not dramatic. Not exciting. Just, mildly interesting, slow-moving, and a little strange. So we've covered walls, beds, blankets, and hats. We've touched on furs, heated stones, and sleeping animals. Now let's drift into the human side of medieval nights. Because even warmth is only part of the story. People thought about sleep differently back then. Night wasn't just for resting. It was also for planning. For worrying. For quietly judging the world. Let's float over to a royal example, because who doesn't enjoy mildly judgmental royalty? Take Edward III of England. He spent long winters in castles that were impressively drafty. He had all the money in the world for blankets and furs. But he also had ambition. And ambition is incompatible with relaxing. So he often lay awake, in his multi-layered bed, staring at the ceiling. He worried about wars. About succession. About whether the Duke of Gloucester had enough socks. And yes, some nights, probably about whether he had left the fire too low. It's a comforting image, in a way. Powerful man. Wealthy man. King. And yet, still negotiating layers of wool to stay alive at night. Now, commoners had it worse. Servants and lower-ranked castle workers slept wherever they could. In small chambers, often shared, near kitchens or stables. It wasn't glamorous. But it was warmer. And humans are funny. Even the rich sometimes envied the poor for this small comfort. Imagine that, envy over slightly better body heat distribution. History is hilarious if you squint softly. And then there's the matter of rituals. Yes. Medieval sleep came with its own little rituals. People checked their bedding before sleep. Refluffed straw. Adjusted furs. Wrapped scarves tightly. Made sure the nightcap was snug. A minor act of survival disguised as bedtime routine. Some nobles had elaborate bedtime routines. Footmen would bring water, adjust clothing, or whisper reminders to pull the blankets closer. Even the act of getting into bed could be ceremonial. And yes, there was often light conversation. Low whispers. Soft discussions about court news. Or a mildly sarcastic remark about the cook's soup. Because what else are you going to do when it's 2 a.m., freezing, and the walls are silently judging your choice of bed location? Now let's float toward a slightly stranger aspect, personal habits. Some nobles slept with small, portable heat sources in bed. We mentioned stones and metal pans before. But there were also water bags heated on the hearth, wrapped in cloth. Occasionally, someone might overheat their corner of the bed, causing an awkward scramble mid-sleep. Everyone adjusted. Everyone survived. Mostly. And hygiene, in case you wondered, was flexible. Bathing was rare. Even nightly cleaning of sheets wasn't standard. Cold nights, damp bedding, and limited washing meant, well, medieval furs and fabrics were slightly pungent. But that didn't matter. Warmth mattered more. Let's pause for a moment and drift over to another royal quirk. Consider Margaret of Anjou. She was queen in the 15th century. She had servants, beds, furs, and heated stones. Yet she often suffered from night chills. She reportedly wrapped herself in layers of blankets, fur, and sometimes extra linen garments, sometimes to the point of restricting movement. Movement restriction is not ideal for sleep. But warmth trumped comfort. And she was not alone. Many noble women shared similar habits. Nighttime was a time for survival strategies more than relaxation. Even monks had their own rituals for staying warm. Dormitories in monasteries were long halls with many beds. Body heat mattered. Sometimes monks slept in shifts to share warmth. And yet, everyone still felt the cold. It's worth noting that in these castles, wealth didn't equal perfect sleep. It meant slightly better odds. Better odds that you wouldn't wake at 3 a.m. shivering uncontrollably. Better odds that your furs wouldn't slide off mid-sleep. But medieval nights were still medieval. Damp. Cold. Lying in wait. Let's glide over to another slightly ironic detail, bed design. Royal beds were huge. They could accommodate several sleepers comfortably. High posts. Heavy curtains. Canopies that trapped heat. And yet, with all that effort, they were still drafty. So nobles layered furs, blankets, and sometimes their personal attendants under the bed covers as well. Not for intimacy. For warmth. Body heat, in a time without radiators, was invaluable. And the more people in one bed, the better the chances of surviving a cold night without stiff fingers or frostbitten toes. Finally, let's take a soft look at mindset. Because warmth was not just physical. It was mental. Medieval people expected cold. They accepted discomfort. Sleep was slower. Waking in the middle of the night was normal. Segmented sleep, as we mentioned before, was part of their rhythm. And people coped. Quietly. With small comforts. Heaps of blankets. Warm stones. Head caps. Body heat. Layered clothing. Sometimes a dog. All these small interventions formed the medieval sleep ecosystem. And it worked. Mostly. The next part will gently explore how these survival habits influence daily routines, mood, and even the strange emotional quirks of nobles. Because when nights are long, cold, and endlessly slow, minds wander. So settle back. Pull the imaginary blankets tighter. And let's drift into the psychology of a medieval winter night, when we continue. Hey guys! Tonight, we begin with something slow, quiet, and maybe a little cold. So dim the lights. Stretch out. Settle in. And let your mind drift back to a time when castles ruled the landscape, and sleep was complicated. I'm talking about medieval castles. Those grand, stone fortresses that look romantic in paintings, but in reality, were, well, glorified refrigerators with ambitions. Stone walls, high ceilings, drafty corridors, and fires that never quite seemed to reach every corner. Sleep wasn't just sleep. It was a battle. A slow, shivery negotiation with the cold. Now, let's set the scene. You're a noble. Or maybe a king. Maybe you're rich. Maybe people fawn over you. But tonight, all that wealth doesn't make the stone any warmer. Castles were made of stone because, well, defense matters more than comfort. Stone was durable. Stone was strong. Stone was cold. And it held that cold like a grudge. During the day, maybe sunlight hits the walls. Maybe a fire crackles in the hearth. But come nightfall, the warmth retreats, slow and grudging. It doesn't vanish instantly. It's more like a polite suggestion that heat might exist here once, long ago, in another era. And if you touch the wall at midnight, it feels exactly like regret. Cold, hard, persistent regret. Now, windows. Or, as they were known then, defensive apertures. Glass was expensive, fragile, and therefore rare. Most windows were small slits, sometimes covered with shutters, sometimes with cloth. Maybe animal skin, if someone was feeling optimistic. So wind and snow had a way of slipping in. Not dramatically. Not with a crash. Just quietly, slowly, relentlessly. And the floors. Stone floors. Cold. Damp. Your breath might fog slightly when you move. Your feet definitely feel like two ice blocks that forgot they were human. Even kings and queens suffered. They had the best beds, the best blankets, the best furs, but also the largest rooms. Which meant more cold to fight. The irony is delicious. The most powerful people in Europe, with armies, castles, and gold, often slept worse than the servants huddled together in small chambers near the kitchens. And speaking of beds, let's float over there. Because beds were the first real defense against the cold. A proper medieval bed was more than a mattress on a frame. It was a project. A statement. A tiny fortress within the castle. First, the frame. Usually wood. Sturdy. Massive. High off the ground to escape the freezing stone floor. Then the mattress. Not memory foam. Not springs. Straw. Hay. Dried leaves. Feathers, if you were extremely wealthy. Yes, feather beds existed. Soft, warm, and slightly pungent. They absorbed moisture. Which, given medieval hygiene, meant they were effective but never pristine. Over the mattress came layers. Sheets, usually linen. Then blankets. Wool was king. Thick, heavy wool that smelled faintly of sheep but trapped warmth like a miracle. And furs. Often animal pelts, layered on top. Sheep. Goat. Sometimes deer. Soft side in. Rough side out. Occasionally still with hints of whatever the animal had been thinking before becoming bedding. Curtains were another important layer. Yes. Curtains. Bed curtains. Not for romance. Not for privacy. For warmth. For posts. Heavy fabric draped on all sides. Sometimes a canopy overhead. This created a small microclimate, trapping body heat. Body heat. Yes, people often shared beds for warmth. Not romantically. Just strategically. Children slept together. Servants slept together. Even nobles sometimes had attendants in bed. Privacy was optional. Survival was essential. And then there were nightcaps. Because heads lose heat quickly, and medieval people noticed this long before science caught up. Long nightshirts, scarves, layers, layers, layers. Feet tucked. Hands tucked. teeth not chattering too loudly. Heated stones. Metal pans with embers. Wrapped carefully and placed in bed. Hot water bottles of sorts. Primitive. Risky. Effective. And yet, despite all these measures, people still woke in the night. Segmented sleep was common. A first sleep. A quiet interlude. A second sleep. During the waking hours, people prayed. Adjusted blankets. Whispered quietly. Added logs to the fire if they could. Now let's float over to another royal quirk. Edward III of England. A king with armies, castles, and enormous wealth. Yet he still worried about the cold at night. Lying in his massive bed, wrapped in furs, perhaps a dog at his feet, he still fretted about fires going low. About courtiers. About taxes. About whether someone forgot their socks. The life of a king. Full of power, full of blankets, full of shivers. And it wasn't just him. Margaret of Anjou, Queen of England in the 15th century, also had nights spent wrapped in layers of wool and linen. Sickly children. Drafty rooms. Heated stones and purring dogs. The usual medieval nighttime ensemble. Monks also had their own strategies. Dormitories with rows of beds, body heat shared among many. Some slept on wooden planks with thin straw. Cold and discomfort were normalized. In essence, medieval sleep was a carefully managed project. Not a passive state. You layered. You planned. You monitored warmth. You shared heat with others. And you hoped the stone walls, the embers, and the heavy curtains did enough. Even the most privileged people endured. Even they woke shivering, adjusting blankets, sighing quietly, before drifting back into sleep. And as we drift further into the quiet of the castle night, we notice another layer. Psychology. Because long nights in cold stone rooms affect the mind. Royal children, courtiers, servants, all had thoughts and routines shaped by these slow, chilly nights. In the next part, we'll explore those thoughts, those subtle habits, and the curious emotional quirks that arose from living and trying to sleep amidst endless stone, fire, and drafty walls. For now, just imagine yourself lying in that castle. Curtains drawn. Hey guys! Tonight, we begin with a gentle journey into a world of stone, shadows, and slow-moving nights. So dim the lights, settle in, and maybe pull a blanket closer, because we're stepping into a medieval castle, where sleep was a delicate art, and warmth was something people negotiated, layer by layer, breath by breath. Castles look beautiful in movies, don't they? Towers reaching toward the sky, banners fluttering, knights patrolling. But the reality, well, let's just say romance took a backseat to survival. Stone walls are excellent for defense. They are less excellent at keeping you cozy at night. High ceilings, drafty corridors, tiny windows that barely let in sunlight, all of it conspires to make the average castle chamber colder than you might think. And that's just the beginning. A quiet night inside a castle wasn't filled with soft linens and flickering candles for ambience. It was a test of patience, endurance, and ingenuity. Let's float gently toward the first line of defense, the fireplace. Fireplaces were essential. Hearths were massive, often taking up an entire wall. They could roast a joint of meat, heat water, and, ideally, ward off frostbitten toes. But here's the catch: castles are huge. Stone absorbs heat slowly, and worse, it releases it even more slowly. Sometimes it just refuses to release warmth at all. The noble might sit beside a roaring fire and feel only slightly less cold than someone in the farthest corner of the hall shivering quietly. And speaking of nobles, kings and queens were not exempt from discomfort. Take King Henry IV of England, for instance. He had the funds to have furs stacked like small hills, yet on cold winter nights, he reportedly wrapped himself in layers of wool, linen, and even additional servants, because body heat is a limited resource in drafty stone rooms. Yes, he used human warmth as insulation. It's not romance. It's logistics. The wealthy could do more, yes. Heated stones, layered bedding, multiple blankets. But even these measures only mitigated, never eliminated, the relentless cold. Now, let's float over to the bed itself. A medieval bed was more than a place to lie down. It was a survival capsule. The posts were heavy, the frame elevated from the floor to avoid frost, and the mattress, well, mattress is generous. Straw, hay, dried leaves, and for the elite, feathers. Feathers were soft, warm, and slightly pungent. Moisture from breath and body collected, giving the bed its own ecosystem of warmth. Curtains hung on all sides, trapping heat. Think of it as a tent within a stone chamber, where each layer of wool, linen, or fur was a small victory against hypothermia. And people slept together. Not necessarily in a romantic sense. Family members, attendants, even pets, all were strategically positioned to share warmth. Nightcaps were common, because head heat escapes faster than anything else. Socks, extra shirts, scarves. Layers were life. Let's drift towards something slightly more experimental, bed warmers. A hot stone, sometimes wrapped in cloth, sometimes a metal pan with embers. Placed in bed carefully to warm sheets before sleep. Effective, yes. Risky, also yes. Burns and fires were occasional side effects. But warmth was worth the gamble. Sleep patterns themselves were different. Segmented sleep was normal, a first sleep, a quiet waking period, a second sleep. People used this interlude to pray, to reflect, to adjust bedding, or to add logs to the fire. It was not insomnia. It was a rhythm dictated by environment and routine. Even pets played a role. Dogs slept near feet. Cats curled up in corners. Animals were not companions for affection, they were furry heaters, silently contributing to survival strategies. Let's float over to the human side of things. Royal children often suffered from chronic illnesses exacerbated by cold and damp. They wore layers, sometimes slept with attendants, and were swaddled in furs. Sleep for them was both a necessity and a carefully managed project. Servants and lower-ranked workers had smaller spaces, closer to kitchen fires or stables, which ironically gave them better warmth than some nobles enjoyed. It's a peculiar twist. Wealth didn't always equal comfort. Sometimes it just meant you had a bigger, colder room to manage. And yet, the nights continued. Long, slow, and filled with small adjustments. Fluffing straw. Wrapping furs. Repositioning stones. Adjusting blankets. Checking the fire. Whispering quietly with someone else awake. Now, let's gently drift toward the psychological impact. Long nights in cold stone chambers produced subtle habits and routines. Emotional quirks. Mild paranoia about drafts or misplaced blankets. Thoughts that wandered endlessly, softly, in the half-light. It's hard to exaggerate the quiet importance of warmth, routine, and preparation in these settings. Even the most powerful kings and queens developed rituals. Adjusting a blanket just so, patting the sleeping dog, whispering to an attendant, ensuring the hearth maintained a steady, if modest, heat. So, as you imagine yourself lying in that drafty castle chamber tonight, think of all the little measures medieval people took to survive the cold. Curtains, furs, straw mattresses, hot stones, segmented sleep, shared body heat. A world where sleeping was an art of patience, ingenuity, and mild discomfort. And as we drift further into this quiet night, we'll explore the personal quirks of some of these royals. The strange routines, the little obsessions, and the subtle emotional meltdowns that unfolded while the castle slept, or pretended to sleep, around them. Take a slow breath. Adjust your imaginary wool blanket. And let's float further into the subtle, chilly, oddly comforting world of medieval nights in the next part. In our next archive, we'll quietly explore why medieval castles felt warmer at night. For now, let the fire fade, and rest.